America has always stood as a beacon of democracy. You are extremely proud of this in your book. Yet the administration under which you served trashed that part of the American brand when it came to the legitimacy of that 2020 presidential election. Yet in your book, you barely talk about either Trump's attempt to overturn that election or the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. Is that because you felt ashamed of those episodes, sir?
No, I was the Secretary of State and the CIA director. And so the book is focused on how we delivered security abroad. But I'm happy to talk about January 6, 2021. It was a bad day at the Capitol. The security team there failed to prevent these guys from rioting there. I agree. The world looks at that and says, goodness gracious, what the heck's going on in America? And so that part of the day, I regret. It's terrible when folks commit these kinds of acts of violence, and I hope they'll be prosecuted appropriately for doing that. But make no mistake about it, that night, America also showed its strength. Vice President Pence finished the election. We had a peaceful transition of power.
But, sir, you famously said in the middle of Trump's attempt to overturn that Democratic vote that there would be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. You've said since that you were joking, but it was deadly serious, wasn't it? And it proved to be deadly serious in what we saw happen. And we were all genuinely shocked around the world to see this happening to a great democracy. Do you regret saying that now, sir?
No, ma'am. Ma'am, if you will take the time when you put this out, if you'll show the whole statement I said that day, it would be greatly appreciated, because taking a little piece out of context is the worst. You shouldn't do that to anyone. To read the whole statement I made that day, I spoke decently about the United States of America. We had a tough election. We had things take place in that election which weren't right, we did not have a sufficiently transparent election. And I don't describe it as being stolen, but there were lots of anomalies in our election, and we can't have that in the United States.
Okay, so let me.
I then worked tirelessly to deliver that very peaceful transition to my successor, Secretary Blinken, and we actually executed that. And so when you pull out this one comment, you're not doing the world any service by misleading the world about what actually happened to that day.
So do you believe there was voter fraud in that election?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. There were things that took place. We had hanging chads in 2000. Hillary Clinton still thinks the 2016 election was stolen. So we have a number of challenges. We run a very dispersed election system. And so we need to make sure that when we're doing absentee ballots and we have people that are out collecting those ballots, that we do so in a way that we're confident that if Sally is the city councilwoman, she got the most votes. If Pete is the county commissioner, he got the most votes. It is incredibly important to our system that we get that right. And there were certainly anomalies in that election, as we've had in many of our elections here in America. And we should work to fix them.
As Secretary of State, can you understand why I undermined you?
Ma'am, I'm sorry. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I told your team that we had to end 7 minutes ago.
Sorry.
I apologize, but I must go.
For opponents of American foreign policy, Mike Pompeo is like the textbook example of why. Here's this guy doing a book tour where he preaches about delivering security abroad, while at the same time, he worked in an administration that literally incited a coup against the U.S. government. Maybe, just maybe, we stop listening to people who are so utterly incompetent and corrupt that they can't even keep their own house in order before lecturing everyone else about the rest of the world. Just, for starters. The reporter here is Beth Rigby, Sky News' political editor and host of her eponymous show, holding Mike Pompeo's feet to the fire in a way that we rarely see on American television, which, of course, is owed to the fact that we have a completely bifurcated media ecosystem where Republicans largely do only right-wing shows and Democrats largely do only left-wing shows. I myself have tried to get interviews with a number of Republicans, and the farthest right I've gotten was Adam Kinzinger, which should pretty much tell you how willing they are to be challenged. But luckily, because Beth caught Pompeo on his book tour, his desire for exposure and money meant that we'd actually see a real interview. Now, on the issue of January 6th, notice how Pompeo laments the fact that the security team failed in keeping the situation under control, as if that was the issue, that the Capitol Police weren't better prepared for when the President of the United States incited a coup on the Capitol. Like, here's a crazy idea. Maybe the Capitol Police shouldn't have been better prepared for that because the President should never have done it. It's like, imagine if Pompeo's buddy set off a forest fire and then complained that the fire department didn't come fast enough. These people are so desperate to redirect the conversation away from the actual issue at hand, the cause of this, that they'll point to anything other than what incited the attack in the first place. Pompeo then goes on to pat the Trump administration on the back for ultimately overseeing a smooth transition of power. Now, first of all, I think you lose the ability to call the transition smooth when the thing that precedes it was a violent coup and a gallows in front of the Capitol. Just going out on a limb with that one. But second, that there was a transition at all was no thanks to Pompeo. Remember, he himself said that there would be a smooth transition to a second Trump turn when asked. Now, Pompeo ultimately tried to convince us that that was a joke, but Rigby rightly calls him out for not joking and instead that he was deadly serious. But in fairness, here's that clip.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
Get it? That's comedy, folks. Watch out, Kevin Hart. Here comes Mike Pompeo onto the scene, and my man knows how to get a laugh. And like Rigby said, if the fact that it wasn't a joke wasn't already clear by just having the most basic grasp of the English language and social cues, it was also not a joke in the fact that the whole administration also tried to manifest that second term into a reality. You don't get to try to literally do the thing that you claim to be joking about and still have plausible deniability. And then, of course, without fail, Pompeo does what all of these Trump apologists do, and that is to claim with some tone of authority, well, you know, there were anomalies in the last election, as if to try and justify the big lie, whose natural conclusion was the insurrection. Now, let's be crystal clear here. There was no widespread fraud that would have come even moderately close to changing the outcome of the election in a single state in this country. There were a handful of voter fraud cases, as there always are, which were found and prosecuted, most of which, by the way, from what's been reported in the media, were committed by Republicans. But otherwise, you might want to ask yourself why these quote-unquote anomalies weren't brought up in court. If they were that significant, that obvious, that egregious, that Mike Pompeo is using them as some defense of Trump's stolen election claims, then certainly a judge would have been interested, right? And yet not a single judge found evidence of fraud in more than 60 cases that were brought forward by Trump and his allies, including 9 judges who Trump himself appointed. If none of those people could rule in their favor, then where does Mike Pompeo get off by standing there 2 years later and still pointing to some voter fraud that doesn't exist? If you thought these people had any remorse for what happened on that day, Pompeo's actions right here should show pretty clearly that they don't. And finally, Pompeo leans on this talking point that Americans need to be able to have confidence in our elections. And that's true, but what's also true is that the only thing undermining confidence is these Republicans, like Mike Pompeo himself, going out and doing the undermining. The reason that some Americans don't have confidence is that they are being fed information that is meant to undermine confidence. And then those Republicans point to the people who they themselves just manipulated as proof of their theory. It's like if you handed out beers to everyone and then complain that everyone's getting drunk. You can't point to the consequences of your own actions as if it's some unrelated phenomenon. And yet that's the point. These Republicans know that it's not really about presenting any facts. If it was, they would have done that in court when they had more than 60 opportunities to do so. It's just about creating a public pressure campaign based on their lies. They know that if they can repeat the idea that there was fraud or anomalies enough, then people will inevitably start to believe that and lose faith in the process. And then people like Mike Pompeo will go on air like he just did and point to those people who've lost faith in the process as the result of his own talking points to prove his point. It's all this circular logic scheme to try and defend the indefensible. Mike Pompeo shouldn't be on a book tour. He should be banished from political life forever. And luckily, Beth Rigby helped show us exactly why that is. Before you go, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. You can click the thumbnail right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work even further, the best way is to subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. There you can check out my interviews with major players in the world of politics, including President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Katie Porter, Jamie Raskin, and so many more. Plus other interviews that live exclusively on the podcast. That link is also right here on this screen, or just search No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen wherever you listen to podcasts.